You're listening to Talking Law, the podcast where business owners just like you discover how to avoid legal landmines and build value using smart legal tips.
Hi, it's Joanna Oakey here and welcome back to Talking Law, a podcast proudly brought to you by our commercial legal practice, Aspect Legal. Our last episode in Talking Law was part one of a two-part series with rugby league great Michael Maguire talking about the topic of leadership. However, we are interrupting the second part of this two-part series with a special episode as an interlude on some very important new legislation. And we'll be bringing part two with Michael Maguire in our next episode of Talking Law. Now, unless you've been living under a rock, I'm sure you've received tons of emails with privacy policy and terms of use updates in the recent past. This all relates to the General Data Protection Regulation, or given that's quite a mouthful, the GDPR. The GDPR is an EU-based legislation, but even though it comes from overseas, the reality is that it can potentially impact organisations here in Australia. So in order to talk about this topic, we've brought on board Marianne Waldron from the Master Advisor Program and our very own Elizabeth Lee from Aspect Legal. And together we'll be discussing the GDPR and its impact on businesses here in Australia. Well, Marianne and Liz, thank you so much for joining us today on Talking Law. Liz, how about we start off with you from a legal perspective? Why don't you give us a little bit of a rundown of what the GDPR means for businesses here in Australia? Because I think there's a lot of concern that I've seen in the marketplace about who this applies to in Australia, what businesses it applies to and what it actually all means.
Yeah. So the General Data Protection Regulation was put in place, it came into effect on the 25th of May 2018. But of course, it's been in the works for a good couple of years in the EU. But I think that for many Australian businesses, it's sort of come around pretty quickly and hit them quite suddenly. Had this sort of influx of,
Concern.
Yeah, that's right. It's been bubbling along. And anyway, this affects businesses that collect, store, handle, and transfer personal information, and particularly where it relates to EU citizen or a person located in the EU. And I think that for the most part, Australian businesses hadn't seen themselves as being in that position, but I think increasingly they've come to realise they actually could be exposed.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, you know what, this all reminds me a bit of the Privacy Act commencement here in Australia, actually, I must say. And in fact, not just that, but any of the legislation that we've had come in over the last couple of years, the Personal Property Securities Act legislation, anything that is, I guess, a major change, we see businesses not really taking any action until like the eve of the commencement of the legislation. And then suddenly everyone's all in an uproar about it, trying to work out what it actually means for them. And I guess that's where we are at the moment. And Marianne, maybe this is where I might point over to you. Is this part of the reason why you've put together the events and the kits that you're working on to help bring businesses into the understanding of what's going on in this GDPR legislation?
Yeah, look, Joanna, thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me on your podcast. Look, absolutely, I was, very concerned about it. I helped produce some programs for ABC Radio National, and I was looking at GDPR, and I thought, gosh, this date's coming up. And then I did a little bit of research, and then I realised, oh my God, no one knows what to do. Yeah. And when I spoke to various accountants and lawyers and small businesses, no one really knew. And some of the big law firms were like, oh, yeah, we've got people in the UK and in Europe who will call in to help. But I don't think anyone in Australia, unless you're a multinational with a lot of Europeans on your database, really did a lot about making sure they are GDPR compliant. And then all of a sudden, just as the 25th arrived, we all got inundated with thousands and thousands of notes or emails in our inboxes from everyone saying they're GDPR compliant.
It was a bit hard to miss, wasn't it? We had
And anyway, I ended up ringing up the ABC saying, I think we need to do an event on this. And they agreed. And so I did some research and put a panel together. And then I did some more exploring, and I found some people in the UK who were selling kits. And so I rang them up and I said, could you make these available in Australia, please? And so I then found you, Joanna, and I thought, we need a privacy lawyer as well as we need a compliance organisation like we found from Mojo U in the UK. And Reverend Mark James has actually been operating, for quite a few years, but he's been looking at GDPR for the last couple of years, and he's put in place an amazing online training program where he helps take people through what you need to do. And I've been doing the online training, as I believe lots of other people, in Europe have done, and it's absolutely phenomenal information, and there's so much more to the GDPR privacy than I ever thought. And there is a bit of a jump from our Australian privacy laws to be GDPR compliant. So that's why I said, okay, let's get the kit, let's make it available to all Australians. We'll give 20 minutes with a legal privacy lawyer and then 20 minutes with him. He's giving a month's online support with the basic level templates kit and then a month of online training, which is all part of the kit price. So, anyone who goes to the event in Melbourne on the 20th of June, which is going to be a phenomenal event. We've got the Victorian Information Commissioner speaking, someone from Dolby talking about audio, and then someone from Kenico, which is a CMS, big European company that have made their whole system GDPR compliant, so it's easy for some of the big set websites in the world to work through them. And then also a lawyer from Swinburne Uni. So it's going to be a really interesting discussion. And my thing that I came up with the first time was like, what about me? I know a lot of Europeans. I've got some Europeans on my database. I don't want to be in trouble. So that's why I was concerned. And I run some entrepreneur programs, and I rang up some of the entrepreneurs who've got over $1 million in revenue and said, do you know about GDPR? And some of them didn't. And then one of them sent me a note saying that she's GDPR compliant. And I rang her up and I said, who did it for you? And she said, we couldn't work out how to do it. We asked my lawyer and he didn't know. So my board member did it for us. And I'm like, okay. And I'm thinking, wow, does she actually know all the implications of this? And it's bigger than it's something about training a whole new culture about, data processing and who controls the process, who controls the data and where the data is going. So, for example, if I, as a small business, had a virtual assistant in the Philippines, I'd have to make sure that my virtual assistant was working for a company that was GDPR compliant. Otherwise, if they've got access to my data, that could be a breach. So everything you do, all your processes need to be looked at.
And look, that might be a good point for us to talk a little bit more about the legal elements, Liz, as well. So a couple of the things that you're talking about there, Marianne, I think are worth drilling into a little bit further. So firstly, looking at the Privacy Act here in Australia. So the Privacy Act, generally speaking, isn't applicable to small business. So that's businesses who have a turnover of less than 3 million. Now, there are some exceptions to that for businesses that process health-related information and some other exceptions, but generally speaking, businesses who have a turnover of under 3 million aren't captured by the Australian privacy law. But Liz, this is interesting.
That's right.
The GDPR seems to be capturing even these small businesses.
Yes, that's right. So right up until now, the small businesses, as you described, didn't have to comply with the Privacy Act. But all of a sudden, they find themselves having to comply with this European law.
Which potentially is far more stringent than...
Yes, that's right, which has far more heavier penalties for not complying.
Well, that's the big thing, isn't it? So, penalties here we're talking about of up to, up to 4% of
global income. It's not just your European income. So it's your global income or 20 million euros. I mean, people like Facebook were regularly getting fined $2 million a day for breaches in Europe, and they didn't care. But now it's several $billion a day, so they do care. So, it's they've really hiked up the fines to make everyone accountable. And one of the key things that is happening in Europe that is not happening in Australia yet, but it will, because of the Senate legislation or the motion that we're going to go towards GDPR, is that the right to be private. People can actually, as citizens, say, I do not want to be marketed to. And I want to know exactly what's on your database and where my information is going and who's looking at it.
Yes, that's right, Marianne. Under the GDPR, they have a right to be forgotten completely. So that's quite...
Right to be forgotten. I like that term.
Right to be forgotten.
Don't you love the terminology that we see in all of this?
Yeah. So that's new to the Australian privacy framework to have the ability by companies to be able to completely erase all information about a particular customer.
Yeah, and I guess this is where we come back to a systems approach, because really this legislation has both a legal element, but in one sense I don't think the legal element is perhaps even as large as the systems element and the technology.
Yes, that's right. There's a real process behind this that has to come into play in order to comply with the GDPR.
And one of the things that I've realised is that, by going on this journey, it actually makes us all much better, much more accountable for what we do. For example, I'm a small business and, a lot of the small business breaches are through human error. And so for me, if I'm leaving my office or going away, I have a lockable safe, I have a lockable door to my office. And what Mark James has been talking about is that, sometimes small businesses leave, forms with credit cards on the front desk and people go to lunch. I mean, anyone could grab those. You've got to be so diligent with everything you're doing with anyone's data. And a breach, you have to let the various information commissioners in Europe know within 72 hours if it's a major breach like credit cards or someone stole all your credit card data. And also you'd have an obligation, I imagine, I don't know, I'd check with you, Elizabeth, you'd have to tell your bank, wouldn't you? And you'd also have to alert the Australian authorities and also maybe the customers involved.
It's a really good point you raise here, Marianne, because we've got, and I guess, this interplay of the two different legislation. Once again, I think it's really important that we reiterate that this legislation is not legislation at the moment in Australia. It's only relevant to Australian businesses in that the EU has passed this legislation in respect of organisations that deal with EU citizens. So where you have clients that are based in the EU or you have people on your database, you're collecting information from people who are based in the EU, then that is the type of business who will be caught by this EU legislation. But just to be clear, it's not legislation here in Australia right now. So the exposure that you have is that an EU regulator might take action against you here in Australia. So, just so that everyone knows, because it's very confusing, where does this legislation...
It is. And if people want to know more about it, I mean, they can go to the Master Advisor Program website and they can find out about what's in the kit and also what the event's about in Melbourne. And that The good thing about that event, Joanna, is that it will be pre-recorded and broadcast later. So, we can actually make that available. Your customers, your podcast customers might want to see that link later and listen to it.
That sounds fabulous. And then I think, one of the other things that I wanted to point out here is that I think one of the strategies that people are using, and you even touched on this, Marianne, is that people are saying, okay, well, I don't know what to do, so I'm going to go and check out the privacy notice that I've seen, one of these millions that I've seen emailed to me, and I'll just, I'll just take a copy of that. But I think the important thing is that GDPR compliance is not just replicating a document that someone else's notice. It's about understanding that notice and its application to you. It's about living what you say in that notice, but it's also about being very careful about the interplay between what that notice might say and your rights and obligations or non-obligations under Australian privacy law. So you just have to be very careful as a business, if you're based here in Australia, not to suddenly make yourself liable for non-compliance with particular elements that you might set out in your privacy notice if you didn't actually have an obligation under Australian privacy law to meet those elements. So there's a lot here for businesses to understand that might, on the face of it, perhaps look more simple than it is. So, and I think, Marianne, this is where, you know, the event that you're putting together with the kit, with information about how people apply some of these principles in their, you know, in their own business environment are so important.
Well, yeah, and that's why we put this GDPR handbook together, and there's a checklist, you know, in terms of marketing to people, you've got to be so careful now what you do, because there's not only the privacy policy, like you were saying, there's a cookie policy, there's a processor policy, and there's different levels. You know, there's a controller, which is the company, and then there are processors, which could be staff members or they could be third parties that you're dealing with. So, you know, you've got to have processors agreements, and those processors must be GDPR compliant. So there's a lot more to it, and the way marketing has been done and artificial intelligence on selling to people, there are some really big changes happening. So I think that's why it's really, really important to do some training. Get the kit by all means, but the training is important, the email support, and of course the Australian law and what it means for you, because there could be some citizens, I think, that, you know, only have a couple of people on their database who are EU citizens, and maybe they can actually handle that separately.
Yeah.
And I think you and I talked about that before, Joanna. Yeah. But if you have quite a few, if you're an online business and you sell quite a bit of stuff of merchandise to the EU, you really need to be very, very careful, because is that data being processed through China? Is it through India? Is it through GDPR compliant companies? They're the things that you really got to look at. Who's looking at your data?
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So, look, I guess just as a quick summary here, and we'll put a link through in our show notes through to details of the event and details of the kit, so you can find out more.
Also, we've got a webinar that people might want to go on, and that's free. That's next Monday, the 18th, and if you could put a link to that too, Joanna, because
absolutely we will.
That's a 1-hour webinar at 4 p.m. and Mark James, who's done 1,100 companies, 4,500 churches, I think it was 11 universities, accounting firms, legal firms. He's actually trained a lot of organisations to become GDPR compliant. So anyone who wants to go on that webinar would probably really benefit from understanding what's involved. And he's going to go through some of the templates and just talk for an hour about what's involved. And I think that's, especially those customers who have EU clients, be really good for them to listen to that.
Oh, look, that sounds fantastic. Well, we'll link to that in our show notes. A lot of people listen to these podcasts well into the future of when we make them live. So if the events that we're talking about here and the webinar that we're talking about here are past the date that you're listening to this podcast, then we probably will have some recordings available. So what we'll do is we'll just make sure in the show notes that we also link to any recordings that have existed if you happen to be listening to this podcast after the dates that we're talking about here. So, okay, let's wrap this up with a little bit of a summary. I guess just as the first pointer, GDPR legislation is here. It's here right now. It's commenced, so it's on foot. I think the second point is it's not Australian legislation. However, it might impact businesses in Australia. The sorts of things businesses need to think about are probably, firstly, the extent to which you have any of your clients or your databases based in the EU. And then you need to have a bit of a think about whether or not you need to be looking at the legal policies and your agreements and potentially your systems, if to the extent that you have clients or people on your database that are based in the EU. Now, Liz or Marianne, do you have any other quick things to throw out there? Anything else that our businesses who are listening in should be considering in relation to this new legislation?
No, but I mean, I'm really interested to hear how long it's going to be before the Senate motion becomes law. I mean, I don't know how you can predict that, but all the information commissioners in Australia, privacy information commissioners in Australia, talk to the National Information Commissioner, and I'm sure that they're putting in place something at the moment because, you know, if it's gone through the Senate, it can't be that far away. Is that your thinking?
Well, look, I don't know. I haven't heard much buzz around it.
No, me neither. Yeah.
Have you? No, not much on your side. So, you know, certainly from our perspective, we haven't heard much buzz around it being mirrored in Australian legislation. The legislative process here in Australia can take quite a while. Well, anywhere really, but it'll be really interesting to watch this page. And look, I think whether or not it becomes law anytime soon here in Australia or impacts our current laws as they are at the moment in the Privacy Act, of course, if your business, even if you don't have European clients right now, it might be that as your business expands, you do. So it's certainly something for businesses to keep front of mind, I think, as they're expanding and growing.
Absolutely. I think that's, especially because we seem to be a pretty digital savvy country, and we've got a lot of online entrepreneurs doing some amazing businesses all over the world. And so, you know, it's just like, yeah, we've got to make sure that these people know about it. I mean, you don't want to be the person who was made the example of doing the wrong thing, do you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, thank you so much, Marianne and Liz, for joining us today. It was great. We should do more discussions in the future. I like this panel of three.
It's great, isn't it? Yeah, look, I mean, I'm sure that we will further down the track once we've sold some more kits. And
well, you see it in practice as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's very interesting to see how this all evolves. Absolutely.
And perhaps we've got to get Mark on here as well.
Absolutely.
Mark from Mojo U, because I think he would be a terrific one for your, listeners to hear from. I mean, he's the one who's running the webinar. So
And I think, you're absolutely right, because here we are, all three of us are here sitting in Australia talking about legislation that hasn't come out of Australia. So, I think in the future maybe we'll look to have, particularly as we see the evolution of this legislation now starting to be applied, really love to hear a European perspective. How are businesses dealing with it overseas?
I agree with you. I mean, what he said to me the other day when I was chatting to him, that it took one company who had done all their GDPR compliance, and it took them 18 months, I think, to put it together. They're a chiropractor firm of 50 people. They had 50 customers, regular customers. One of their customers said, we want to know where our data is. And so they went online and they were able to tell their customer everything within 8 minutes.
Wow. Gosh.
And that's because of the processes that were put in place by Mark and all the templates. It's a fantastic opportunity for anyone who wants to actually learn this stuff and put better processes in place in their own organisations.
Great. Thank you again, Marianne and Liz. We'll leave it there, but we'll probably be back to you at some stage in the future to give you an update on this new and developing area. But until then, check out the show notes and go and have a look. If you are lucky enough to be listening to this before the 18th for the webinar and the 20th for the event in Melbourne, then check out the show notes to see how you can go along as well. But have no fear, if you're listening to this after that date, there's still loads you can do. So check out the show notes. We'll leave you lots of information about how you can access the kit and get in contact with all of the people on this call as well as Mark. Thanks, guys. Well, that's it for our episode on the GDPR and its impact on Australian businesses. If you'd like more information about this topic, then please just head over to our website at talkinglaw.com.au. Through that website, you'll also be able to find details of how to contact our lawyers at Aspect Legal if you'd like help with any of the items that we covered today in relation to privacy and its impact on your business or the GDPR. Also, if you would like to contact Marianne at the Master Advisor Program and participate in some of these really useful information and learning events Marianne Waldron has on offer, and indeed, if you'd like to look at purchasing the kit full of templates and assistance and advice, including the advice of our lawyers here at Aspect Legal, just head over to those show notes at talkinglaw.com.au, where you can find links through to each of the seminars, webinars, and kits that we spoke about on the podcast. And finally, if you enjoyed what you heard today, then please pop over to your favourite podcast player and hit subscribe. And if you really enjoyed it, then consider leaving us a review. Well, that's it for today. Thanks again for listening in to Talking Law and Joanna Oakey. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to Talking Law. Tune in next time for more smart legal tips and tricks to keep you clear of those legal landmines. If you want to get a download of today's show notes, head over to talkinglaw.com.au.
Are you looking for a top quality legal team to assist you in your organisation? Aspect Legal is an innovative commercial legal practice that specialises in providing fast and professional services for their clients. If you'd like to chat about how we might be able to assist you, simply head over to our website at aspectlegal.com.au to book in a time for a free discussion with one of our lawyers.